Over the years, Wales have been blessed with some fantastic fullbacks. As soon as I say that, names like JPR, Lee Halfpenny and Liam Williams probably flash into your mind. But the player I want to look at in this video might not be the first name you think of, and to be fair, he didn't take the most conventional route to the top, but at one point was being touted as the best 15 in the world, and that is of course Lee Byrne. Byrne's one is a tale of a rise right to the top tier of international rugby, and then a somewhat unceremonious exit from the Wales setup in where he describes a certain attack coach in a less than favourable light. But as ever, I like to begin at the beginning. The start of Lee Byrne's career is somewhat different to the average modern day professional. Lee was born in Bridgend and grew up on the notorious Wild Mill Council estate, but he didn't play rugby for any Wales age grade system, and in school he was somewhat of a troublesome individual who suffered with dyslexia, which wasn't diagnosed. One of his early influences was actually BBC's Phil Steele, who was his PE teacher in school, and Steele, realising Byrne's ability, persuaded his mum to allow Lee to play at a higher age group to aid in his development. Even with this push though, Byrne's early rugby career wasn't anything special. He didn't play rugby for most of his teens until joining his local side, Bridgend Athletic. He then left school at 16 with no qualifications, trying out multiple different jobs in a search for what his future would hold. As it happened though, just at the right time in his fledgling career, he would start working with a guy called Brendan Roach. Roach was a scrum half who played for Tondy in Division 1, but had once played for Bridgend in the European Cup. Both he and Byrne would share their mutual love of rugby, and Roach would become somewhat of a mentor for the young Byrne. Seeing the extra work that Roach was putting in really inspired Byrne, and they would both regularly wake up at the crack of dawn and go and train down Merthyr Mawr come rain or shine, before heading into work. This extra training and help from Brendan really rubbed off on Byrne, and he would quickly break into the first team and quickly get himself noticed by other teams as he helped Bridgend Athletic get promoted to Division 4, and they actually made the Silver Bowl final in which Lee was crowned the man of the match. Now, Division 5 isn't the highest standard, and I can say that because I played in that league before it changed, but I think this was an important part of his development. He was of course more skilled and more athletic than other players playing in that league, but this allowed him to hone his skills and play without fear. There is also an edge of toughness playing in those leagues. Even Byrne himself mentions how difficult it was going up and playing some of the Valley teams who would often give him a shoe-in, which this no doubt helped him improve his toughness as he progressed into his professional career. After helping Bridgend Athletic get promoted, there was a few clubs higher up the league structure who wanted Byrne's services. Newbridge actually made him an offer, but Lee actually decided to turn them down and signed for Tondy, where his mate Brendan was playing. Lee would now be earning more than beer money for playing rugby, and I think he started to realise at this point that it could potentially be a career for him. An interesting aside, Byrne actually has some Scottish heritage, and seeing an opportunity to perhaps fast track his professional career, he went on a trial game to Scottish Excels, though in his own words he only played about half an hour of a game and he never got a call back from them, which is quite a funny story really when you consider how decorated his career was with Wales. Had a head coach from the Scottish Excels realised what he had in a young Lee, we might have never seen him turn out and be so excellent in the Red of Wales. Anyway, at Tondy, Byrne's development would continue and more good performances would get him noticed by coaches around the league. It then didn't take long for the offices of Gareth Jenkins and Nigel Davis to be informed of this up-and-coming star, and they invited him to come down to Stradey Park for a meeting. After a successful chat with the coaches, Gareth Jenkins told him to go back and finish his season at Tondy and then come back at the beginning of the next year and train with Llanelli in the pre-season so they could evaluate him there. Interestingly, this would be the 2003-2004 season in when the Welsh teams would go from clubs into regions. So to say Byrne was excited is an understatement, and he immediately snapped up their offer. It seems fate though would speed things up for Byrne. Not long after his meeting, Byrne would head into Tuesday training with Tondy, and his coach informed him that there had been a bit of an injury crisis at Llanelli and that they had called him up to play against Ponty, this coming Friday at Sardis Road. Now, you can imagine how surprising and daunting this would be. Not only would he be playing his first ever professional game within 3 days' notice, but it would be up against Ponty in the House of Pain in the club's final ever game before they changed to the Celtic Warriors. Luckily, his full-time employer allowed him to have the rest of the week off so he could go and train and have a few sessions with the first team. Doing this, though, didn't necessarily go to plan, and Byrne admits that he was a little bit starstruck training with the Llanelli team, and the nerves and the pressure sort of got to him a little bit, and he was dropping high balls, slicing his kicks and all that sort of thing. Lucky for him, once it got to game time, he switched on and had a quality performance, and though Ponty were the victors that evening, Byrne really impressed his teammates and coaching staff and would be called into a meeting the following week with Gareth Jenkins, who retracted his offer to start training in next season's pre-season and instead offered him a 3-year deal development contract to sign with the Scarlets. At age 23, Lee Byrne would ditch his forklift driver's job and begin a new career as a professional rugby player, and I guess there's a lesson in there for all young aspiring athletes. His contract would be to train full-time with the Scarlets, but have 2 sessions a week with the Llanelli team, which was now semi-pro, and then he would be playing the bulk of his games for Llanelli while the coaches would see how he developed over the season. Byrne would enter that pre-season in absolute peak fitness, beating club records in both running and endurance rowing, a testament to his hunger and how hard he was working outside of the training pitch. His impressive conditioning and performances quickly earned him a fast track to the Scarlets team, as Gareth Jenkins was happy to give him an opportunity, and he made his debut for the region against Munster early on in his first season. He then got an interesting opportunity to go and play in an invitational 7-a-side tournament in Dubai, and with the blessing of the Scarlets, who hoped playing in this tournament would aid in the young fullback's development, off he went in an all expenses paid tour to Dubai. Sport, though, is often a cruel mistress, and whilst it gives with one hand, it takes with another. And just as things were going so good, while playing his first game in the Sevens tournament, he would tear his anterior cruciate ligament in his knee, and that would rule him out for at least 6 months. So unfortunately, he had to spend basically the whole of his first season rehabbing his knee and getting back up to speed. As the 2004-2005 season began, Lee started to feel his way back into playing. Whilst he did turn out for the odd game for the Scarlets, he played most of the season for Llanelli in the Premiership, having a good season with the side as they won the Connacht Minolta Cup in the Millennium Stadium. At the end of that season, Lee would have another minor surgery on his knee just to clear out any issues he was having. But unfortunately, this was the beginning of an issue that would follow him through his career. Having said that, heading into the 05-06 season, now fully fit and sharp, Byrne began to get more opportunities with the Scarlets, managing to win the first place job over another quality fullback, Barry Davis. His howitzer of a boot and his great vision for hitting lines and angles from fullback really started to catch the attention of everyone involved in Welsh rugby, including a certain Mr. Mike Ruddock, who not long had just won a Six Nations in his first season as head coach. A little shameless plug, if you haven't seen it, I made a video about Ruddock's time as head coach, and I'll put the link in the description so you can check it out after I finish with this one. Anyway, back to the story. That autumn, Lee would receive his first call-up for the Welsh squad, and to be honest, he wasn't actually surprised, as Scarlets Chief Executive Stuart Gallagher had recently pulled him into his office and said that he'd had a call with Mike Ruddock saying they were interested in taking a look at Byrne and putting him in the training squad just to see him what he's like in the camp and what he's like in a training setup, what type of skills he had. So a few weeks later then, when the call came, off to Wales training Lee went, but was quickly and extremely shocked when he found his name on the team sheet for the first game against the world's best team at the time, New Zealand. Unfortunately though, this game wasn't really much to write home about. He did make his debut around the hour mark, but Wales were crushed by the All Blacks 41-3. But Lee didn't care. He'd gone from working in a warehouse to playing for Wales in a couple of years, which you have to say is mightily impressive and practically unheard of in this day and age. As the autumn series was due to come to an end and Lee was about to head back to the Scarlets, he had an interesting conversation with Mike Ruddock, where it had come to light that no conversation had happened between Mike Ruddock or Stuart Gallagher about Byrne coming into the squad and just training with him. This then started the cogs in his head, because at the end of the aforementioned meeting with Gallagher, the chief executive had mentioned to Lee that his current contract was going to be up at the end of the season and they'd like to offer him a new contract, a 3-year deal worth around $25,000 a year by the end of the 3rd year. Being a bit shocked that this contract was offered in a slightly strange circumstance, Byrne opted to take it home and had yet to look over it and sign it. After having this conversation with Ruddock, he had come to the conclusion that Gallagher anticipated that Byrne was going to get some game time in the autumn and attempted to play it down, saying that he'd spoken to the coach and they were just going to have a look at him in training, because he thought if Byrne got an opportunity in the autumn, his market value would go up and he was looking for more favourable terms for the Scarlets. Now, this is just Byrne's side of the story, but apparently this left a really bad taste in his mouth, and though he did really appreciate the opportunity that the Scarlets, Gareth Jenkins, had given to him, he decided that he wanted a new challenge at a different club. And as it turned out, there was another region just a few miles down the road who had just won the league for the first time in their history and were starting to put together a squad of galactic proportions. Before that though, Byrne had started to make his mark on the international scene, and he started settling into a role in the Wales squad. This was a great time for him personally, but for Wales it was an extremely rocky time. So obviously what was going on was, only a year after winning the Grand Slam, Mike Ruddock decided to resign after a victory against Scotland in the middle of the Six Nations tournament. This was a surprise to most of us, but not many people involved in the squad. Now, as I said, I've covered this subject extensively in the Ruddock video, but in researching this video I found some interesting quotes from Byrne talking about the type of issues Mike was facing. In his autobiography, The Byrne Identity, clever title, and it's actually a really good read and you should check it out, Lee says that, quote, "As the coach pulled into the hotel in Richmond, Mike asked the players not to go out on a night out. With that, he got off the bus. At that point, a senior player stood up and told the driver to take us into London anyway. Poor Mike was left to walk alone into the hotel," end quote. He does mention a few other things, and it's actually really interesting to get the perspective of someone who was actually there at the time but has no agenda to cover up. Anyway, after Scott Johnson came in as caretaker manager and went on a horrendous 3-game run, he left to go back to Australia, and as it was, Wales named a coach that was already familiar with Lee's ability and work ethic, the Scarlets head coach, Gareth Jenkins. His first charge as coach of Wales was to take the team on a 2-match tour across the Atlantic to face Los Pumas in Argentina. On a personal note, I remember this tour quite fondly. I remember there was a camera crew following them around behind the scenes as they travelled around and went to Patagonia to visit the Welsh-speaking settlement down there. And at the time there was a lot of fuss around 2 young second rows who were set to make their debut. One of them was Ian Evans and the other one a certain Alan Wynne-Jones. On the pitch though, the team was not successful, narrowly losing in the first test but getting comfortably beat in the second. There was a personal moment for Byrne though. In the second test in Buenos Aires, he scored his first international try. Unfortunately, this tour was a little bit of a precursor for the rest of Gareth Jenkins' spell as coach of the national side, and certainly a subject for a video that I'll do in the future. But as the tour ended, Byrne looked ahead to a new challenge in a new team, the Ospreys. So going into the 06-07 season, the Ospreys were the new dominant team in Wales. They had just won the Magners League and were now in a new state-of-the-art stadium that they were sharing with Swansea FC. With Mike Cuddy as the financial backer, they began to attract some quality players to the Liberty Stadium. When Byrne joined, there was already the likes of Shane Williams, Gavin Henson and Alan Wynne-Jones in the region, but they were also bringing in players like Mike Phillips and other world-class talents like Jerry Collins and Marty Holler to build up an amazing squad, which quickly were coined as the Galacticos. When Byrne finally signed his contract with the Ospreys, he went from making £8,000 a year on his development contract with the Scarlets to making £50,000 a year. So you can only imagine what those top-tier international imports were earning. It must have been crazy money. Naturally, the Galacticos were successful on the pitch. During his time at the club, they won the Celtic League 3 times, were runner-up in the Anglo-Welsh Cup in 2007, losing to Leicester Tigers in the final, only to meet the Tigers in the final the following season and actually beat them this time. Also, they were the first and only Welsh regional team to defeat an international touring side, beating Australia 24-16 in 2006 at the Liberty Stadium. Byrne was a huge part of the success at the region and was largely able to stay fit and produce consistently for the team. Where the Galacticos probably didn't reach the heights though was in the European Cup, and even with all that talent they just couldn't seem to get over the line once they got into the knockout stages. In the 07 season they lost 19-10 in the quarterfinals to Saracens. In the 08 season they lost 43-9 to Munster in the quarterfinals, but I'll give Byrne a pass on that one because he was actually injured. And in 08 they actually heartbreakingly lost 29-8 to Biarritz in the quarterfinals. And actually in that European campaign there was a bit of controversy in an incident involving Byrne during the pool stages against Leicester Tigers. Byrne had gone off as a blood injury and Sonny Parker had come on to replace him, and obviously the game continued for some minutes when Lee reappeared and was ready to take the field. I'm not exactly sure how it happened, but what did transpire was Lee had gone back onto the pitch without anyone else coming back off for him, meaning that the Ospreys actually had 16 players on the pitch at one point. Making this worse is during the 50 seconds that the Ospreys had a man advantage, the Tigers were attacking deep in the Ospreys territory with an attacking scrum, and Lee was actually part of the defence that snuffed out the Leicester attack. The Ospreys went on to narrowly win 17-12, going through to the knockout stages of the Cup at the expense of Leicester. So as you can imagine, the Leicester Tigers team and fans were incensed. They launched a complaint and legal action against the Ospreys, and the Ospreys were fined €25,000, and Byrne himself was suspended for 2 weeks for his part in the incident. Though this was rescinded on appeal, which I guess is fair because it's not really his fault that the mixed up happened, because no player would just run on the pitch without being told. Anyway, the quarterfinal hoodoo is quite a strange one for the Ospreys though. In 6 quarterfinal appearances in both tiers of the European Cup, they have never managed to get a win and make it through to the semis. Either that's just terrible luck or there's some sort of mental block, I don't know. Back to Byrne though. During the beginning of his time at the Ospreys, he had yet to fully stake his claim as the Wales' first choice 15. Lucky for him, actually, he missed on the 2007 World Cup debacle as Wales crashed out in the group stages, leading to Gareth Jenkins unceremoniously being sacked. This led the way to a new coach who would change the fortunes of Welsh rugby as an international power and catapult Lee Byrne from quality player to the best fullback in the world. Warren Gatland took up his new role on the 1st of December 2007, knowing that he only had till the 2nd of February before his first match as head coach. This was not just any match either. This was the first game of the Six Nations away at Twickenham. So with little time to get the players in and access and implement a game plan, Gatland decided a bold strategy of picking 13 Ospreys players to start the game. The other 2 players were Martin Williams and Mark Jones, and Byrne was obviously amongst the Ospreys players that were selected. Anyway, everyone can remember this game, but it is one of the most games of 2 halves you'll ever see. England absolutely dominated the first half, and were it not for some last-ditch defending by Hugh Bennett, who managed to hold up Paul Saki late in the first half, England would have probably been out of sight. Annoyingly, there's not a lot of highlights of this game, so I can't find the exact clip of this excellent bit of defence. Anyway, as it were, the teams go into half-time with a scoreline 16-6 to England, and they looked in complete control and for all money were going to cruise to a comfortable victory at home. I've heard Byrne talking about this actually on some podcasts, and he gave a little bit of an insight to the change room at half-time. He says that the players sat down and no one really said much. They were all just looking around, expecting the coaches to come in and give them a dressing down. As Gatland, Shaun Edwards and co calmly came in, the players were shocked when the first words that come out of Gatland's mouth were, and I'm paraphrasing here by the way, quote, "That was one of the best defensive performances I've ever seen from an international team." And as the players are looking around wondering what the hell's going on, he carries on and says something like, "They're literally thrown everything at you and they're out on their feet. Now go out in the second half and really put the pressure on them." End quote. Lee admits that the players started thinking, yeah, they're out on their feet, and they felt like they could get back into the game in the second half. I guess that's like the ability of a top quality coach like Gatland, and that's been one of his strengths in the past, to like instill confidence in players that are struggling with it. Maybe he could whip that up right now, that would be helpful. Anyway, as the boys go out in the second half, they begin to put pressure on England, who start making silly mistakes and putting themselves under pressure.
What is the point in doing this? Is there any point?
And from there on, Phil Vickery gets caught.
Worse.
Mike Tyndall gets into trouble. Andy Gomersall gets caught.
Yeah, well, I mean, Gomersall made it better, but he was given the ball when he shouldn't have been. The very first man, when you're in trouble, has got to take the responsibility and go straight.
This, of course, then fed into the confidence of the Welsh boys, thinking that what they heard at half-time was true and England were out on their feet. The first try is initially some great work by Mike Phillips, who actually gets caught at the base of the ruck, but draws in two players before shipping the ball out to James Hook. Hook then does his magic, puts in some lovely footwork and dances around Paul Saki, draws in another two defenders and frees up Byrne to put him in the corner. And this is like a famous sight that just for some reason when I think of this game I always remember the picture of Byrne sliding in on his knees. Anyway, Hook then nails the conversion from the touchline with an excellent kick, and you can actually hear who I think is Neil Jenkins screaming and celebrating as the kick goes over.
Brilliant by Hook.
Instantly from that then, England kick off, Wales return the kick, and then another mental lapse by the men in white allows Mike Phillips to charge down Ian Balshaw. And then right now you get to see the absolute class of Gethin Jenkins, who picks the ball up from his bootstraps, and instead of ploughing ahead forward like a normal prop would, he looks around for some support, passing to Martin Williams, who then also shows his excellent footballing ability, getting the ball out to Phillips, who initially started it all with a charge down, and then he finishes superbly in the corner. Absolutely mental. Hook then nails the conversion again from the same spot, and from that point Wales never looked like being in trouble. This game launched what would become a famous Grand Slam, along with launching the career of many of the Welsh players, including Lee Byrne. And I think at this point it's important to point out that Byrne actually gives so much credit for his development at this point to Shaun Edwards. Early on, Edwards took Byrne aside and expressed to him that he thinks he could be world class and that he just needs to believe in himself. Now you have to remember that Byrne didn't get a professional contract until he was 23. He never won a cap at age grade and was never part of any academy system growing up. And within a few short years, he'd gone from working in a factory to starting games for Wales in Twickenham, which is just insane. And he openly admits that through the early part of his playing career, he really suffered with confidence and had a slight imposter syndrome, which again is so understandable for like someone who had such a meteoric rise a bit later in their career. He points out that Edwards, noticing this in Lee's personality, he made it his personal task to help him deal with his lack of confidence and gave him tips on how to improve as a fullback and not dwell on his mistakes in the game and just move on from them instead of letting them eat him up. It's actually funny, Byrne says that one of the tactics that actually worked, that they worked out together, was that if Lee made a mistake, he would just rub his hands together, and that was like rubbing the mistake away, and you just get on with the next job. And Lee actually says he used this in games, which helped him a lot. And it's no coincidence really that with this help from the coaching staff, you begin to see a more confident player who began to believe in his ability and started building in a real attacking mentality even when it came to his kicking. Whether it be one of those trademark up and unders which he so often recovered for himself, or that giant left peg that he used to pin teams back in their own territory. His famous kicks are what he's generally remembered for, and rightly so to be honest, but what sometimes gets overlooked is his amazing ability to pick angles and pick holes in the defence. And if you watch, a lot of his breaks come from running amazing angles off players, knowing that if they get their hands free, he's going to burst straight through. Interestingly, when I've now listened to interviews and stuff with him, he spoke very candidly about his dyslexia. As someone who suffers it from myself, I found it very interesting to hear what Lee has to say about it. He admits he's had a lot of issues remembering calls and set moves, and he kept all of these issues hidden from his teammates and coaches for most of his career. He actually had like little tactics to cover up these issues. So one of them, he admits that if he was in training and they would call a move that he wasn't sure about, he would like go down and pretend to do his laces or do like a bit of stretching and tell the other fullback to run through, and then once he'd watched a few reps, he then jumped in when he knew what was going on. It's mental when you think like how well he often played for Wales, that a lot of the time he was unsure of where to run and what moves were being called. It's just crazy. So once the team began to win in 2008, Byrne was an ever-present fixture in the team. In the autumn of that season, he played against all the 3 Southern Hemisphere teams, putting in good performances and getting on the score sheet against Australia as Wales edged out the Wallabies for a famous win. This put him on the radar for many people as a potential call-up for the Lions tour next year. Even Jeremy Guscott was calling him world class. The following Six Nations in 2009 was a funny one for the Welsh squad. They entered into the tournament as defending champions with expectations quite high, and once they'd won their opening games against Scotland and England respectively, there was a real buzz around Welsh rugby. But unfortunately, the third test against France was a bridge too far. Even with Lee getting on the score sheet, Wales would fall to the French 21-16. To be fair, Wales recovered against Italy, setting up a crunch game against Ireland in the Millennium Stadium. Going into this one, Wales knew that they had to beat Ireland by more than 13 points to claim the Six Nations for the second year in a row. Ireland themselves were going for the first Grand Slam in 61 years for the country, so there was a lot riding on this one. Both teams stole momentum back and forth from each other. This wouldn't be a particularly memorable one for Lee though, as he was forced off early with an unknown foot injury. The game would be remembered though for Stephen Jones nailing a late drop goal to take the lead, and then Ronan O'Gara replicating the same trick to edge Ireland back in front, only for Wales to go back down the other way, and with the clock going red, Stephen Jones, who had been superb off the tee, came up just a few metres short with his penalty effort. As Wales went from potential winners to 4th in the championships by such fine margins, which is mad when you think about it. Regardless of their eventual standing, there was a lot of Welsh players that had put their hand up for the Lions selectors, and you'd probably say Byrne would have been one of the first names on their list. The issue now was working out what that weird foot injury was. As it turned out, Byrne had plantar fasciitis, which is when the band of connective tissue at the bottom of your foot that connects your heel from your toes becomes irritated or starts to come away from the bone, and in Lee's case it had actually snapped. It's actually extremely painful, and the only real way to heal it is by rest. Lucky for Lee, he had some time to rehab it before the Lions squad was announced, and in April 2009 Lee was named as one of the 2 fullbacks along with Rob Kearney. On tour, to be fair, Lee was probably at the peak and pinnacle of his abilities. He was on complete fire on the pitch, and in the battle between him and Kearney for the 15 jersey, Lee was just edging out the Irishman, and not just catching the eye of selectors, but catching the eye of other coaches in South African Super Rugby. As the squad for the first test was announced, Byrne's name was there at 15 on the team sheet, and his hard work and amazing performances had paid off, and he was going to be a test lion. As the players went through their warm-ups in Durban, he soaked up the atmosphere, and Lee realised that he was at the top that any British or Irish rugby player could reach. But fate has a funny way of working, and regardless of how well the body felt during the warm-up matches, the unthinkable happened in the warm-up for the first test. As they were going through their drills, he felt that familiar snap that he'd felt in the Irish game, and he knew instantly the plantar fasciitis had returned. As devastation set in, Lee called over the physio, and they attempted to do what they could to get him through the game. He finished the warm-up on his own, and with the adrenaline coursing through his veins, he ran out to a sea of red and green for the first test against the Boks. Unfortunately though, his head was only in one place, and that was, can my foot last? and unfortunately, for anyone who can remember it, it didn't. He played through the first half hour, but as the playing increased more and more, the adrenaline slowly subsided and he realised it was going to be impossible for him to continue, and frankly unfair to his teammates for him to even try. On the 37th minute, he was taken off and would be forced to watch the rest of the game from the sideline. It must have been absolutely crushing. In fairness, Ian McGeechan did give him a slight bit of hope as he asked him to rest up for the week in training and sit on the bench for the second test. This would at least give Byrne a fighting chance of being able to represent the Lions one more time. But of course, fate intervened yet again, as a collision with Keith Earls in training led him to dislocate his thumb, and that was it for his Lions career. Now of course things like this happen, fairly common occurrence during the Lions tour, but it's so disappointing that a player in such a rich vein of form is forced out of the tour in such depressing circumstances, and in my opinion he was the best 15 in the world at the time, and it's just a shame that he didn't get to fulfill his potential as a Lion. Even that though, his performances were impressive out in South Africa, and in fairness, one of the franchises, the Stormers, actually attempted to sign him after the Lions tour. He even went for a coffee with a certain now world-renowned coach, Rassie Erasmus, and they offered him a contract to go and play in Super 14. Byrne was interested in taking the offer, but the Ospreys would not release him from his contract, so the chance for him to be one of the few Welsh players to go and play in Super Rugby just had to go by the wayside. Not all was lost for Lee though, because it was around this time that he met his wife Andrea, who some of you might recognise from the ITV news, and the couple actually would marry in 2012. But anyway, back to 2010. Before heading back to rugby, he actually had a tryout with NFL Europe. Apparently they were seeing him as a kicker, and he went to do the tryouts and see what he was like as a punter. Even though, in his own words, when he caught it a few times he made some excellent yardage, they just said he wasn't quick enough and he was at the risk of getting charged down too often. So it was back to rugby, where Lee was fully fit and back fighting and played a big part in one of the best comebacks in international rugby. Biased view, of course. I don't want to go too much into detail with this one because I covered it extensively in my Andy Powell video, but this game is absolute pure carnage, and Byrne was actually heavily involved in the Welsh fight back and some of the less than happy incidents. There was of course that terrible incident with Tom Evans where the winger awkwardly collided with Byrne, fracturing his spine and nearly costing him his life. This one is of course nothing to do with Byrne, it was just a freak accident. But then also in the fight back, Lee made one of his trademark breaks off Jamie Roberts' shoulder, who got a brilliant offload off, and as he was through one-on-one with Phil Godman, he chipped it over the outside half's head, and Godman actually tripped him, and he then received a yellow card, and then Wales got a penalty and kicked it to draw level, and then we all know what happens next. Wales go on a crazy few phases of attack as Scotland are down to 13 men and Shane dives over under the post for a mental win. But after that, the Scottish head coach Andy Robinson was actually accused Byrne of diving to get the penalty. Lee of course admits that he went down easily, but he says he was definitely touched. And I obviously have a bias, but it seems to me clear as day that Godman did trip the fullback, and it was just a bit of frustration from the coach because his team just blew such a massive margin. By this point, Byrne was a mainstay in the Welsh team, but that knee injury that he got so early in his career really started to give him issues, and at 2010 he had to have yet another surgery in where his surgeon told him at the end that there was basically no cartilage left in his knee and it was just bone on bone, so it must have been pretty painful. Luckily he was fit enough to get on the field for the 2011 season, and this was an especially important one because this was the year, of course, the World Cup was in New Zealand. Going into the World Cup camps though, his confidence was a little bit dipped and he didn't know how his knee was going to go, and as the physical grueling exercises that the coaches put the players through started to take his toll, his injured knee really started getting inflamed. He noticed he was falling further and further behind the pack after the first week, and he was usually always one of the ones at the front, and by the second week he simply had to pull out of the fitness. Knowing that he was falling behind, Lee would go back to what he knew best, and that was his his mentality to just work a little bit harder than everyone else. So that meant his rehab, he was doing extra bits and doing late night sessions on his own in the gym, doing anything he could do to keep up with the rest of the players and improve the speed of his rehab of his knee. Through sheer grit and determination, he managed to get himself back fit enough to join back up with the squad and finish the last leg of the camp. His knee though was ever niggling at him, and his trademark howitzer boot simply wasn't firing like it used to. What made it worse is that he knew the coaches were picking up on this. Neil Jenkins was constantly trying to give him a lift and give him some encouragement and give him some little technical changes to try and improve things, but unfortunately not all the coaches were as particularly encouraging, as he noticed that a pattern started emerging from attack coach Rob Howley, who offered some less than constructive criticism. From Byrne's account, he says that any time he made a mistake, Howley would be shouting at him and berating him in front of the other players. And any time he did something good, like a 60-metre kick into touch, it was met with stone silence. He obviously admits that he was not expecting to be praised for everything that he does, but what he noticed was a clear difference was any time Lee Halfpenny would do something in training, Howley would be very quick to offer praise and encouragement. Apparently the other players started picking up on this, and they actually started taking the mick, shouting at Byrne in Howley's voice, mimicking the coach. On the field, things weren't much better, as his knee was giving him more and more issues, and he struggled in the World Cup warm-up game against Argentina, though Wales eventually did run out comfortable winners. By this point, the issues with Howley were intensifying, and he now even started digging out Byrne for his life off the pitch. See, both men lived in Bridgend, and quite often, if Lee was spotted out, it would get back to Howley in some way or form, and then in training, he would remark things like, quote, "Out again this weekend, was it, Byrne?" Or, "How was your night out, Byrne?" By all accounts, he would do this in front of all the players and the other coaches, and Lee was getting the feeling that Howley was trying to undermine his position in the team and doing everything he could to get him out of the squad. Lee started to think that his last chance to get into a World Cup squad was gone. But another man's misfortune can often be another man's good luck, as unfortunately Morgan Stoddard, who was Byrne's main competition for the 15 jersey, broke his leg in the final World Cup warm-up game against England, and Byrne would make the squad in his place. What was worse was this actually ended up forcing Stoddard to retire, which is so unfortunate because he was a really good player, and I remember when he burst on the scene he was so strong on the ball, I thought he was going to be around for ages. But anyway, as the squad was named for the World Cup, Lee was left under no illusions that he was only in there due to Stoddard's injury, and he knew this because Gatland told him so straight to his face. Again, in his book, he quotes Gatland saying that, quote, "Just to let you know, we weren't going to pick you for the World Cup. You knew that though, didn't you? Well, because the injury to Stodds, you're going." End quote. Absolutely brutal, to be fair. Maybe I guess the coach was trying to put a rocket up his arse or something, and in fairness, Byrne doesn't moan about it, and he says if it was just on form, he's completely right, he wouldn't have made the squad. Be that as it was though, he was on the plane to New Zealand. As the team for the first game against South Africa was named, James Hook would be starting at fullback, though this was not a surprise, and it was something that he and the coaches had discussed because they wanted to give Lee an extra week to rest his knee and get ready for a massive clash against the Samoans. Wales put on an excellent performance and a brave display, coming up just short, losing out on the opening game to the Springboks 17-16. Lee was now fit and ready to play his first ever World Cup game. The Welsh coaching setup though now had a new idea, and as the matchday squad went up on the big screen, Lee just slowly realised that he wasn't in the matchday 23. James Hook would retain his position at 15, and Halfpenny would cover the outside backs on the bench. This was pretty much the first time in Byrne's career since he'd established himself as the first choice 15 that he was left out for anything other than an injury. He would quickly have to shake this disappointment off though, as he was named to start in the next game in a few days against Namibia. Wales of course racked up lots of tries in a high scoring destruction of the Minnows, and Lee himself would get on the score sheet. Little did he know that this would be his last international try. The aftermath of this game though fed into his feeling of being maligned by the coaching staff, as Neil Jenkins jokingly commented that in the build-up to Byrne's try, he intentionally passed the ball early to Halfpenny, expecting him to get tackled, and allowing Lee to finish off the try himself. He says himself that he doesn't know if this was just a bit tongue-in-cheek, but with his relationship with Howley already fractured, this comment didn't help. Looking back at the clip, I would find it hard to think that this was what was going through his head as he passed the ball to Halfpenny. It just seems like a player playing a bit casual due to the nature of the scoreline. Granted, it's not especially professional, but nothing other than that, in my opinion at least anyway. He then retained his spot for the final group clash against Fiji, and by this point, Wales's young team had really started to click and gain some confidence, and Byrne felt that though his knee was basically constantly swollen at this point, he was getting back to his best and he had reclaimed the 15 jersey. As Wales dispatched Fiji by 66 points to 0, scoring 9 tries, which is mad to think of in this day and age, and looking like world beaters, the only thing that put a slight dampener on it for Byrne was that around the 65-minute mark, a message came on the pitch for Lee to switch to wing and Halfpenny to switch to fullback. This of course made no sense in the context of the game, but Byrne put it simply down to the coaches trying to build a bit of depth in the back line. But really this was a preamble for what was to come next. As the team sheet was named for the quarter-finals against Ireland, Lee came to the slow realisation that he was no longer part of Wales's main plans. The younger and fitter Halfpenny was given the 15 jersey, and to be fair to him, he held on to that for a while, so you have to say it was a pretty good decision. But in his book, Byrne does get a little bit salty about this incident, in fairness. He says that the only real reason Halfpenny got picked in front of him was due to his goal kicking, as he felt he was comfortably better in attack and they were on par with everything else. And to be honest, it's hard to disagree that he was a better attacker than Halfpenny, but you could argue that Halfpenny was just a little bit more of a steady Eddie, and he actually wasn't the main goal kicker at that point, so I don't think that one makes any sense. I don't know what the motivation was, but I don't think it was just because of his goal kicking. Not involved in any of the match day preparations, the players that were no longer required decided to go on a bit of a holiday and go off tour, as they say, and a few of them would go on benders, which is totally fair to be honest. By this point, Howley was barely even speaking to Byrne, so he thought that I'm just going to enjoy the next couple of weeks. After one of these aforementioned benders, there was a knock at the door in the morning, and as Lee answered it, barely conscious or closed, the figure standing in front of him was of course Coach Rob Howley, holding a Wales shirt and a pen. He says, quote, "Howley handed me the top and the pen and said, 'Sign this, you two the only two I don't have.'" He then adds that as Howley surveyed the state of the room and the two players in bed, he remarked, "Good night then, was it, lads?" Byrne snapped back with a sarky comment, but admits that in his head he was thinking, that's my Wales career gone. Unfortunately for the main squad though, they played magnificently in the semi-final, but they came up just short to France and that red card. After all the turmoil of the injury and the disappointment of the World Cup for him personally, Lee felt it was time for a change. The Ospreys were announcing budget cuts to the squad, and he took this opportunity to head to a club that he'd fancied playing for a while. Clermont had also been a team that had reached out and inquired about the fullback in the past, and now that he was free to leave, his agent got in touch with a famous French club and they were able to come together and work out a deal. Lee had a pretty successful time at Clermont, though it wasn't always easy to begin with. His dyslexia made it really difficult to pick up the French language. Being embarrassed about his learning difficulties, he never told anyone, similar to before, and he ended up finding himself slightly isolated because he couldn't understand what was being said around him. Part of his contract was that he would be taking part in weekly French classes with the other foreign teammates to learn the language. This flashed him back to times when he was a child and embarrassed and not being able to retain the information he was being taught. At one point, everything came to a head when one of his French teammates questioned him on why he wasn't making an effort to learn the French language. This actually really upset Byrne, as lack of effort had never been an issue for him through his career, and he didn't want his French teammates to feel like he was disrespecting them and not learning their language. After a frank discussion with his wife, she implored him to let the coaches and the team know that he was dyslexic so they could get a bit of a better understanding as to what he was going through. He then decided to actually do this and got properly assessed on his level of dyslexia, and then his teammates finally understood why he was behind the 8 ball in picking up the language. This was actually a blessing in disguise. After this, his French teacher tailored his classes to make things easier for him to pick up the messages and the information that was going around, and his teammates found a different way of communicating their point during matches. One of his biggest helps was his former Scarlets teammate Regan King, who was also at the French club, and between them they devised little cues to help Lee understand what move was being called, and he would help translate any messages that was going on to make sure nothing got lost in translation. Interestingly, when he did get his assessment, something that he learned which he didn't know, and I didn't know until he spoke about it in his book to be honest, that dyslexic people often have better spatial perception than an average person. Lee says that in hindsight, this explains to him how he often was able to see gaps as they were appearing and was able to hit some great angles because his vision was just that much quicker than some of the other players. Unfortunately for me as a rugby player, I missed out on this superpower, but when you think of his angles and trademark runs off the shoulder, you can certainly see that he used this to its highest ability. On the pitch, things also began to improve with the knee injury that had plagued him over his career, and that had basically become unbearable over the last 2 years. And what had actually led to a lot of this improvement was thanks to a less than conventional treatment that he was now getting. So every couple of months he would get some visco supplementation, I think that's how you say it. Don't ask me how or why this works, but this treatment is done by injecting chicken protein taken from the rooster's cob and putting it straight into the joint that has the issue. As gross as that sounds, I have no idea how it works, but by all accounts this allowed him to play pain-free, and to me it's just very strange. Though he was performing well week in, week out over in France, he was never really part of the Welsh setup, and the Welsh management didn't really have plans for him after the World Cup. He did take part in a few squads, but around this time Roger Lewis decided that players that were playing outside of Wales would no longer get reimbursed for their travel to camp. So every time there would be a squad or a camp come together, Lee would have to travel from Clermont to the Vale. And for anyone who is geographically challenged like me, Clermont is a fairly remote part of France, and this commute would require him to fly to Amsterdam and then to Cardiff from there. Also, you need to take into account that he wasn't really involved in any of the matchday squads and was quite often just a camp body. This would end up costing him a few thousand depending how long the camp would go on for and how many times he would have to fly back to play for Clermont during the time. This is just maddening really when you consider the amount of stories and reports that have come out over the years about WRU misspending on board members having all expenses paid jollies, whilst the players have to effectively have to pay to play to train for Wales. It's just another example of the backwards nature of the governance of the Welsh Rugby Union. It's just frankly all quite embarrassing. Even while he was out in France though, and he barely had no contact with the top brass of the Welsh team, he did still manage to find the ire of Rob Howley. So what actually happened was, Jonathan Davies announced that he was going to be moving to Clermont at the end of the season. So a reporter had rung Byrne and asked if he would be willing to comment on what it would be like for Jonathan Davies going over there and playing in the French club. Lee spoke on the phone for about half an hour about how amazing Clermont was, how much he was going to develop Jonathan Davies as a player, and how much he was going to flourish and it would help him in his Welsh career, etc, etc, etc. As the interview was about to come to an end, the reporter thanked Lee for his time and asked what was going on with his international career. And with a bit of tongue-in-cheek, Lee said, quote, "I think they've lost my number," and laughed it off. Didn't think anything of it, but the next morning the papers ran with the headline, "They've lost my number." It's comical really, and part of a reason why reporters get a bad reputation. In any case, Mr. Howley was of course not impressed, and the day that this headline was rang, Lee received a call from the Wales attack coach berating him and asking him why he would say something like that. Lee did his best to explain the situation, and eventually Howley relented. After a bit of small talk, Lee asked Rob how he thought he was playing in France and what he felt he needed to do to get back into the Wales setup. According to Byrne, Howley said, "I'll give you a call back tomorrow and we'll have a proper chat." But apparently that call never came and he never heard from Howley again. After the whole newspaper incident, Lee came to terms with the fact that he would probably never be wearing the red of Wales again. But as there so often has been in this story, there was one final twist, and this time it was Byrne who would be the one in control. So if we fast forward to the final year in Clermont for Lee, he just finished a game earlier that day, scoring 2 tries and now settled down with a teammate in a bar to watch Wales play Argentina in the autumn internationals. Wales would run out extremely comfortable winners against Argentina, but unfortunately a few players in the back line picked up a couple of knocks and ended up going off injured during the game. Not long after the final match finished, Lee's phone began to ring and the name popped up, Rob Howley. His teammate urged him to answer, knowing how much he wanted to play for Wales again, but a few wines deep at this point, Byrne just declined the call outright. He knew what the call was going to be about. Wales was set to face Tonga on the next Friday night, and he knew that Howley was desperate for some cover in the back three. A few moments later, a voicemail comes through. Quote, "Bernie, get on the plane, you're starting against Tonga." End quote. Not the politest way to ask a favour, but it seems like Rob's reputation isn't that of the most polite bloke. Lee took a few minutes to ponder his decision and then he rang Howley back. His phone then went straight to answer phone, so Lee left him a very short but very precise message. Quote, "Forget it, Rob, I ain't coming back." Mic drop. Now, some people might have a different opinion to me, but I think this is totally fair. In my opinion, I think Lee did the complete right thing. When you consider all of the history and animosity that had built up between the two, why would he do him a favour? Because he was clearly being put out as cannon fodder to play in a squad game against Tonga. And this, of course, was not going to resurrect his Wales career. And really, the best outcome he could have hoped was to put in a decent performance and just simply not get injured. Suffice to say, he never heard back from the Wales setup, and he never donned that famous red jersey ever again. His rugby career was not quite over yet, though. His 3-year contract with Clermont was now up, and there were a few other French clubs who wanted his services. But Lee's wife Andrea had put her career on hold to be with him in France, and now it was his time to put her first and head back to Wales. As it turned out, an opportunity arose for Lee to return to Wales and sign for the Dragons. On the surface, this was quite exciting. It would have been an opportunity to live back in Wales, and Lee would be working with his former head coach Lynn Jones, who was now top man at the Dragons. Another exciting prospect was Lynn had offered Lee the captaincy if he joined him in Gwent. Byrne had never captained a side before and saw this challenge as something really exciting with the Dragons, and they offered him a competitive wage package, so off he went to Rodney Parade. While his first impressions of the squad and the facilities were quite pleasing, he quickly noticed that everything was a bit more scarce than Clermont. Now this, of course, he expected, but in his book he mentions being surprised that there was a quota on how much tape a player was allowed to use, and if that was back then, imagine what it's like now with the budgets the teams have. Anyway, Lee did know what he was getting himself in for, and he quickly began enjoying his role as captain, trying to make himself as available for the young guys as he possibly could. As they headed into the new season, things were looking quite positive. His knee was just about holding up, and although they lost their first game to Connacht, there was a good feeling around the squad. His first home game that year was against the Ospreys, Lee and Lynn's former team. Fate again would have a funny way of working though, as Lee would attempt to make a tackle, injuring his shoulder, and he was quickly forced off injured in his first game in front of the Rodney Parade faithful. He got assessed straight after the game, and it was revealed that he had a tear in his labrum in his shoulder. He was told that a week's rest would be all that was needed, and he would be back fit within a few days and ready to play. Now, I am no medic, but even I know that a torn labrum is more than just a quick recovery. In any case, he would miss the next game, but the following week returned to training. Unfortunately though, the pain was not improving, and he was struggling to do the most simple of rugby movements. According to Byrne, Lynn Jones, who was under pressure to get results, was quite pushy for Lee to be available for the up-and-coming games. So with that in mind, he and the medical team agreed that he would go and get some cortisone injections in his shoulder just to help him get through the next couple of weeks. This was of course nothing but a plaster over an issue that actually needed surgery. That being said, they repeated the same trick 3 times in a row for the next 3 matches. While getting one of these injections, Lee asked the doctor how his shoulder was looking. The doctor replied, quote, "It looks like you've got a massive tear in there." Having received this news, Lee decided to get a second opinion, and then it was revealed that he had a 10cm tear in his rotator cuff, and playing on the cortisone injections had only exacerbated the injury. So only a couple of months into his Dragons career, he was now on the sideline and looking like missing the entire season. He had the operation and spent months rehabbing the injury in an attempt to try and get back fit. At this point, Lynn Jones, who was under severe amounts of pressure, began to ice out Byrne. Maybe he resented him because he was taking up a big chunk of the salary cap and not being able to play. Clearly not Lee's fault though. He had an injury, and had it been sorted out properly straight away, he probably would have been back fit playing at the end of the season. After 6 months on the sideline, Byrne resigned to the fact that he was going to have to retire altogether. This actually posed another big issue, because in his Dragons contract it stated that if he was injured for more than 6 months, the Dragons were not obligated to pay him any more wages, so it put him in a really sticky situation. Having come to the understanding that his body had finally given up on him, he arranged a meeting with Lynn Jones and proposed a deal where the Dragons could buy him out of his second year of his contract at a discounted rate. Lee put forward an offer that he thought was fair for both parties, and when he asked Lynn what he thought, apparently Lynn said, "Come back when you're offered something more sensible," and chuckled and left the meeting. Naturally, this annoyed Lee and left a real bad taste in his mouth, and he says that if he saw Lynn Jones in the street today, he would literally just walk straight past him. Jesus. As it turned out, the injury would force Lee to finally retire, and his shoulder never actually properly healed even to this day, and he still has limited mobility. And to be honest, he puts the blame squarely on the shoulders of Lynn Jones and the Dragons medical staff. So disappointing though, isn't it? An amazing career that had come to an end so abruptly. He felt like he could wind down his career helping the Dragons develop a new young crop of players as they were moving into a new era, but instead he was forced to walk away without a penny, having only played 6 games for the region. Now, just finishing on this Dragons part, all of this is from Lee Byrne's side, and I couldn't find anything from the Dragons or Lynn Jones' side, so we'll just have to take Lee's word for it. The next few years were difficult for Lee. As most players, he struggled with retirement, feeling like a lack of purpose. Add on to that, he had the stress of a serious illness within his family. He was unable to make any income due to his injury, and even though he had insurance, the person who set it up basically attempted to scam him, and then he had to go to court to get his settlement paid, and just to add insult to injury, that took 18 months in total. So if you think about it, with the Dragons not paying him for the last year of his contract, you can really see where stress levels would really increase. And the final note was, of course, the tragic death of a really close friend of his, Jerry Collins. Lee and Jerry actually grew very close during his time at the Ospreys. When he first moved there, he lived with Lee, and when he eventually moved out, he would often just turn up at Lee's door unannounced to come and visit him and hang out and stay over. So with all this stress and craziness, it's understandable that Lee actually sort of spiraled a little bit into a bit of a depression, and it took him a lot of work and effort to battle through it. Thankfully, due to the support of his family and friends and the help from a therapist, he pulled himself out of the hole and now lives a very happy life with his wife and daughter. You have to say, though he didn't quite hit that 50 cap mark, which he almost certainly deserved, what an amazing career. Quite frankly, him as a man and a player should be an inspiration to all of us. Though he was gifted and had natural talents, he definitely put in the hard work more than most people did. Out early in the morning before anyone else was getting out of bed, going to the gym after team sessions to get a bit of extra work, and at one point he actually earned the moniker from his teammates as a secret trainer, and they used to wind him up about it. Not only that, he wasn't part of any academy system, and he didn't get recognised by like a lucky chance. He just put in consistent performances and eventually made it impossible for the coaches in his local area to ignore him. He just worked hard, put in the effort in, and the belief finally got him to where he needed to be. Quite frankly, it's a testament to any one of us. If you want something, just keep putting in the hard work and don't give up. It's never too late. On another note, aside from the rugby, since retiring, he's become an ambassador for dyslexia and is very vocal within the community, visiting schools, encouraging children not to hide their learning difficulties like he did and get the help that they need. Again, as someone who has dyslexia, it's quite motivating for me to see someone who is the same as me be so successful on the pitch, but also being able to get over his difficulties and now set up companies and be a successful businessman off it. He also now does a little bit of the after dinner circuit, and we actually had him and Sean Holly at our club once for a dinner, and they were actually both great, and some of the stories they had were awesome, and this just gives me the excuse to casually slip this photo in. As I said at the start, Wales is a country that has been blessed with many legendary players in the 15 role, and it can be quite easy for top quality players to get lost in the shuffle of all that greatness. But Byrne was a massive part of a lot of the success Wales had in the last 15 years, and I hope this video offers a little bit of a reminder of the fact that he did a lot for Welsh rugby and at one point was the best fullback in the world. Thanks for watching.